Welcome to Fuller Speed Ahead. I'm Craig Fuller, right here from Freight Alley in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I have with me Chris Spear, the CEO of the American Truckers Association, talking about what's happening in the market, where things are headed, and a lot of the big issues that are facing trucking companies today. We'd love to hear what is most important and top of mind for your agenda for the rest of the year.
Well, first of all, thanks, Craig, for having me on. It's really a pleasure to be here at FreightWaves and have the opportunity to really talk about some of the issues that our members are seeing. I think broadly carriers are really concerned about the uncertainty in the market. And I think a lot of that stems from trade, the ongoing negotiations, not just with China and the tariffs that are being applied, but also I think the adoption of the USMCA agreement, which will then replace the 1994 NAFTA agreement. So, as you know, trucks move 76% of the surface freight in this country for NAFTA alone. So, 82% of the border crossings with Mexico, 71% with Canada, and there really isn't anything with trade that doesn't involve trucking. So when there's uncertainty with these agreements, that unknown, I think, really causes some concern within the industry. The broader economy, you're obviously seeing it with the markets. That's something our carriers are paying a lot of attention to.
So this narrative that trade tariffs are good for trucking has been batted around by some of the industry. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's a tool. It's a tool that this White House, this president have used to bring parties to the table, apply leverage. It should come as no surprise that the campaign, the president made clear that he was going to use this as a blunt instrument. So folks that are a little surprised about the tariffs shouldn't be if they dial back 2-3 years ago. This was all laid out at the time. He's just doing what he said he was going to do. The actual impact that is having on trucking, though, is real. Clearly we bear the brunt of it. Just look at our truck and trailer manufacturers. They use steel, they use aluminum. Those costs obviously, go up. They're passed on to our carriers, customers. So the whole supply chain definitely feels even the short-term ramifications of this tool being used. However, if it's short-term, if there is, an adoption of these agreements, with Canada, Mexico, with China, with Europe, that certainty, I think, will make all the pain that we're experiencing right now seem very short-term. So there is a bit of optimism that we have to do this. We have to upgrade these agreements. We have to deal with China. This is a tool the president's using to get it done. We're just having to bear a lot of the pain to get there. But if it's short-term, I think we can survive it. If it's long-term and indefinite, that's going to be a problem. Yeah,
it's been a difficult year. Last year was a fantastic year. I talked to a lot of industry executives that believed that this was a longer cycle, that the bullish cycle in trucking would continue for many, many years. Didn't happen. 2019, we've actually seen the opposite, where things have slowed down. A lot of it's probably related to just tariff fluctuations and how it's artificially changed the capacity map and the demand map of the market. I'm curious, as you move into the later part of the year, do you think we'll see some stability around trade policy or
I hope so. We do expect next month the president to submit the USMCA to Congress for consideration and adoption. I believe that the support in both chambers, starting with the House, is there. I really do. I think, talking to the Speaker and the leadership in the House, they will most likely go first, not the Senate. So it really comes down, will or won't the House move on this expeditiously? I think there is a desire to take it up and pass it rather quickly, probably before the end of Q4. You have a presidential election next year. The more we creep into 2020, I think the more problematic politically issues like this get. No one's going to want to give a win to the other side. So if we're going to do trade, we're going to do USMCA. I think by Q4 of this year is it. So I think all sides understand that. If the House goes, say, October, I think it'll go rather quickly in the Senate and get ratified rather quickly. Then you can shift, if that happens, your focus, as the president would like, I think, to China and really focus 100% on that and see where that leads us. But injecting a little certainty into the market would go a long way, not just for the economy, but for our industry.
So we are 18 months into the ELD mandate, soft and the hard mandate. How do you feel that's the response from the industry in terms of safety? Are you pleased with the results from the ELD mandate, or do you have things that you would like to see come along in the future?
Well, I think this is in FreightWaves' sweet spot because knowledge is power. If you understand how the market moves, how the industry operates, is a very important component of that. And ELDs is a catalyst. It didn't change the hours of service. It's just how we record them. We went from a 19th century technology, paper, to an electronic means. Well, welcome to the 21st century. This is what our industry needs to be doing. Embracing technology and the value it provides, it's a very empowering tool. Now, as a building block, I think ELDs can provide even more information that our industry, our carriers, our supply chain can capitalize on, especially when you start connecting that data with other trucks, other, what operations and demands that our customers are putting on us. I think this is a real foundational technology that we're going to see more additional technology be added on to long term. So I'm very pleased with the data. The compliance is very encouraging. If you talk to CVSA, the vast majority of the carriers are complying. We're seeing hours of service violations drop dramatically. That's a good thing. We're all about safety. Technology is an enabler. I think as we go forward, the compliance for converting AOBRDs at the end of this year into the ELD rule is going to be something to watch. We're going to have to really pay attention, especially with the medium and smaller carriers.
Yeah, one of the things I think about ELDs that gets lost on a lot of people, because there's always an argument about pro or con, but for the first time in history, we've had the chance to hold bad actors accountable and recognize the ones that are doing things of quality. We have the Shipper of Choice Award, which really recognizes practices what shippers are doing to make quality of life better for drivers and improve relations with carriers. Response has been great. With ELDs, we actually can know for the first time where drivers are truly being held up, where they're losing hours, and companies that are operating irresponsibly in the market. And both, it holds the carriers accountable and it also holds the shippers accountable. And I think that's a positive development.
Transparency is good, and I think technology has a role to play in that. I think ELDs is a benchmark technology that will really allow us to compare, where the shortfalls are in the industry. It's very revealing. And I also think going forward, connectivity is going to be real key in how we connect cars, trucks, infrastructure. That is the future 5, 10, 15 years out. That evolution through innovation, I think, could be really important to safety, productivity, emissions. There's a whole host of values with congestion that I think could be benefiting from technology. We lose $74.5 billion sitting in traffic every year as an industry. That's 425,000 drivers sitting idle for an entire year. I mean, if you're paid by the mile, you got a lot of time on your hands to think about, hey, I could probably be doing something better with my life. That's a retention issue. Technology can get traffic moving. It can certainly combine with infrastructure reform, really could make our industry a catalyst for growth for the entire economy. So I look at technology as a major player in this space.
Yeah, and as we get more information, that transparency will enable us to understand more about what's happening, what does prove out in terms of safety, how things like hard braking incidents, weather, driver fatigue impact safety, and that's something we're certainly bullish on and talk a lot about here. Let's talk a little bit about, there's a couple of new changes to the hours of service regulations that have been submitted. Where are those at in terms of status, and are we likely to see something come out? Or are you anticipating a lot of friction in Washington?
Glad you raised it, Craig. It's not a final proposal. It's the beginning of a proposal. It's one that we saw a glimpse of a year and a half ago in the advance notice. Those same elements that were proposed then are actually captured in this current rule that came out last week. It's a proposed rulemaking. So right now you have a period of time, about 2 months, for all stakeholders to comment. ATA will be commenting on it. The pillars are essentially fivefold. You've got the short haul, you've got the split sleeper berth, adverse weather conditions, the 30-minute rest break, and this 14-hour clock break as well. And looking panoramically at that, the agency's trying to solicit comment that would help shape additional flexibility for the driver without compromising safety. and also inject some of the realities that the industry is currently facing as technology evolves, some of the conditions that are put on drivers, detention time, parking. These flexibilities are the reality that our drivers face each and every day. The regulations have to reflect that, otherwise they're irrelevant or a headwind. And we don't want them to be that. The agency's been clear. They have good intentions in putting these forth. It's not to compromise safety, but to inject some of those realities. So we will comment on it once the comment period is done, toward the Q4, I'd say. The agency will take those comments, digest them, and then over time post a final rule. Then it would later go into effect. We could see litigation. It's not uncommon. We see a lot of the rules that come out of the agency, one side or the other of an issue, generally will litigate. But you're probably looking at a couple of years out before this is actually full force and effect of law.
A couple years before we see any real change. And who, I mean, it's interesting because talking to a lot of the other associations in trucking at times that you guys don't see eye to eye, it seems like as an industry, most of the industry is aligned with overhauling the hours of service regulations. Where would friction come in?
There is good alignment. Well, the friction gets into the details, I suppose. Safety advocacy groups are going to be pushing back pretty much on all elements. And that's not a surprise to me or most people that follow these issues closely. I think the frustration or the rub there is that, okay, well, if you don't like this, what would you propose? There really isn't any offering other than we need to tighten them even more.
I mean, the fatigue issue is real, and it has to be addressed. I think that is a much more fundamental challenge than the amount of hours you allow, because trucking's inconsistent. There's a lot of inconsistencies that happens on the docks. You mentioned parking is a major issue. I'm wondering, what is ATA doing around parking?
Well, it's tied to a couple of things. One, the hours of service, when you take your breaks, is part of it. If you're forced to take a break at a certain period of time, you got to have a place to park that truck. And if there's no place, you go to the Northeast Corridor, you've been there many times, D.C. up to New York, for instance, or even D.C. to Baltimore. I can tell you on 95, you'll see trucks parked right on the side of the interstate on 95.
Yeah.
That's a major thoroughfare.
It happens driving from Atlanta to Chattanooga.
It's dangerous.
You see them out there, absolutely dangerous.
It's dangerous. So, you look at that, that's an hours of service element to that, which is in the proposed rule. The other piece of it, which is even bigger and broader, and I do think harnesses a lot of consensus, regardless of what view you have, is infrastructure reform. We have got to invest in our infrastructure. We need new roads, new bridges, more parking. Modernization of it has a tremendous measurable return on that investment. We just so happen to have a lot of people in Congress that don't want to spend money on anything. And trying to educate them that infrastructure is not free, it's not cheap, it's also not partisan. We all drive on the roads. It doesn't discriminate based on party affiliation. It's just the right thing to do. And for the conservatives out there, I'm a Republican. I like to pick on my own. They don't want to raise any money. I'm reminding them that Ronald Reagan, the patriarch of the Republican Party, signed a user fee increase, a gas tax increase, twice during his administration. He understood the value and the return that modern infrastructure has on the U.S.'s ability to compete. And just so happens we course those arteries. So it's really important for our industry to grow by having good infrastructure, and that leads to parking.
Do you think diesel taxes versus tolls and user fees are more effective? I mean, there's an argument to be made. Libertarian Cato's come out and talked a lot about tolls being a more progressive or more putting a direct cost on the users versus taxes. I'm curious your take on that.
Well, I'm always interested in where those talking points originate in Washington. We've heard a lot about public-private partnerships, asset recycling. We've heard a lot about devolution. Let's just hand the federal authority, which by the way is in the Constitution, let's hand it over to the states. Well, half the states out there, like Wyoming, for instance, where I'm from, don't have the ability to raise that kind of cash. They rely on the federal match. They have two major intersecting interstates, north, south, east, west, that rely on that federal share. And it is interstate commerce that we're talking about. So devolving it is just a cop-out. It's an excuse by Congress, by members that don't want to raise money. They're not doing their job. Do I feel that the user fee is the best? Absolutely. But I'll qualify that a little, Craig. I think it is the best over the next decade. And the reason I say that, first of all, it's less than a penny on the dollar to administer the fuel tax versus tolling, which is upwards of 35 cents on a dollar. That's not conservative. That's not a good use of money because you're using it for administering the toll. Second, tolling's only good on high throughput, which is really only profitable on less than 1% of the roads and bridges in the U.S. So you're not going to toll in Wyoming.
You mentioned Wyoming, Montana, places of West Texas where there's a vast span of interstate where nothing's there, and so that's an interesting perspective I've not heard.
I think the fuel tax in and of itself, we're advocating what's called the Build America Fund. It's 5 cents a year over 4 years, so a nickel a year over 4 years. You're not even going to notice it, and that's going to raise $340 billion in new revenue for roads and bridges. That's plenty. That's plenty, and it's immediate. It goes right into the trust fund. We're 4% of the vehicles on the road out there, and we're funding half of the Highway Trust Fund, which goes broke next year. So this proposal shores up the trust fund, doesn't add a dime to the deficit. It really is the best way over the next decade to raise revenue. Now, I qualified that because I would say as you see more electric, more hydrogen, more compressed natural gas, alternative fuel equipment being operated, cars too, there will be growth in that space. And as you watch that happen, less and less money will be coming in. There's a disparity. So we have to capture that. I'm not sure what the model is, but we need to have that dialogue now, not 10 years from now.
Yeah, California has had to fight this, or is challenged by this, where they passed high diesel taxes because of electric vehicles, are now having to figure out how to deal with that and how to recover. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Certainly autonomous is a topic that gets a lot, every conversation I go into, usually outside the industry, because I think the industry just, there's much more sort of a rational view of things. But you go to anybody outside of it, autonomous inevitably comes up. I'm curious what your thoughts are on timeline in terms of autonomous. And I'd love to hear a little bit deeper about what is the path to get to autonomous from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I'm not threatened by it. I think technology, as we said earlier with ELDs, it's a catalyst for growth. And we have a responsibility at ATA to put it in context. And we're not going driverless tomorrow. We're not going to go driverless in the next 10 years. I know there's a lot of companies that would like to portray that possibility. I don't see it happen, and here's why. We have pilots in planes. I'm very, very happy at times when I fly that we have two people up there that are responsible in adverse conditions, for instance, but not just passenger planes, but cargo planes. I think you're going to have to remove the driver out of the passenger vehicle before you see drivers come out of the trucks.
And is this a legislation issue, or is this more of a safety and compliance element?
There are safety elements to it that would need to be legislated. Some of it, I'd say most of it, could be regulated, depending on who you talk to. It could be the agency would say, oh, we've got most of the authority, we can do it ourselves. And to some degree they are. DOT's 3.0 guidance that came out is an example of that. Congress is split. They want to deal with the cars, but they don't want to include trucks. And we're like, well, I don't want to inherit a regulatory scheme that was designed by the autos. I like them. I came from one at Hyundai, but I'm not going to let them write the playbook for our industry. We have to be at the table and shape that for the benefit of us, not them. And ours is a little different. We're commercial, we're operating different equipment under different conditions. Our requirements are much different than a passenger vehicle. So we need to be part of that debate, but I think it's more about driver assist, not driverless. I think you can use connectivity, technology. All cars by 2022 are going to have AEB, automated emergency braking, on them. So every car, no matter what level, economy to luxury, if the person's texting and speeding and not paying attention, well, if they're connected to the truck, that car's going to hit the AEB without the person knowing it. That will save lives. So there's a role for technology here in the levels 2, 3, even 4, but taking drivers out, I think we're 50 years out minimum.
No, that's not connected. That's just sensors on the vehicles themselves that do that.
Well, there is sensors, yes. There's also a frequency. We call it 5.9 gigahertz. The FCC right now is debating an auction for that 7 bands. We are advocating that all 7 bands go to safety, along with National Safety Council. We're working with the autos on that. We have global automakers, as partner with that. We want to connect in that bandwidth the cars, trucks, and infrastructure, so they're all talking to one another, and that's empowering, because I think technology can enable those drivers to be safer. Fewer fender benders even are going to save a lot of congestion and time lost for our industry. So I think this is a real good space, and I'm really excited about it, not at all threatened by it.
That's fantastic to hear. Talk a little bit more about safety. Speed limiters are getting a lot of conversation right now. I'd love for you to dive in what that legislation is, and more importantly, what's the timeline for implementation?
Well, there isn't an implementation date as of yet. Our policy for the last 10, 11 years has been 65 miles per hour, but let me be clear, that's not just for trucks, that's for cars as well. So that legislation is actually determined at the state level. So you go state to state, different roads have different speeds. Some in excess, you mentioned Texas, 85 miles an hour, which essentially means you can run 91.
I enjoyed that, by the way. When I lived in Texas, I enjoyed doing 85 to 90.
Wyoming, Montana, I'm the same. But when you have trucks governed at nearly 25, 30 miles per hour lower, 2/3 of the accidents that involve trucks are caused by cars. That's according to FMCSA. So they're hitting the back end of us, they're speeding, they're texting, and that problem is not going away anytime soon. So again, I think if you're going to have a speed limiter, be paying attention to the differential that you're creating, because you could create, by trying to solve a safety issue, you could be creating an issue as well. So we need to look at that. I don't see cars being included, so our policy is only half the loaf. It does match our policy, the legislation being proposed on the Hill, which is 65, but it's for trucks only. So right now we are talking internally about a revision to our policy. The revision would also look to our members to tell us, just in the last 3 years, for instance, what collision mitigation systems, cameras, combined with speed governors, a lot of our fleets are governed, some higher than 65, but what are their accident rates with that equipment? And we're seeing a drastic reduction on the front end. The trucks aren't hitting anything, but on the back end, the cars are still hitting us.
Because the trucks are slower, cars hit it.
That's correct. And you have all this tech up front, the cameras, the anti-collision mitigation sensors. That's on the front end of the truck is doing very well. The accidents are going down. On the back end, they're still going up. So that shifts our focus to the passenger vehicle and the speed differential. So our policy revision is going to be taking a look at that, and how do we craft a policy that may be a little higher speed, but in a combination with that technology.
It sounds like the technology you're talking about in 2022, very well combined with speed limiters on trucks, could solve for that.
And that's where we're trending.
That's really great. Last thing I'd like to ask you a little bit about is hair follicle testing, drug testing. Lane Kidd from the Trucking Alliance has come out and said that as much as 10% of drivers employed in the United States would fail an opiate test. I'm curious your reaction to that study, and then your thoughts on overall drug testing and hair follicle testing specifically.
Well, I think Lane's right, but I think he's probably even understating it, and it's not his fault. I think the data is growingly outdated as more and more states legalize recreational marijuana. But beyond marijuana, you have a widespread chronic emergency surrounding opioid use in this country, and it doesn't discriminate based on affluency. It doesn't discriminate urban versus rural. It's widespread across the country, and it's directly impactful on our industry that has to be clean. It has to be clean so it can be safe. And so on the front end, hair follicle testing is something we've advocated. ATA was very instrumental in getting it into the current highway bill, the FAST Act. We are waiting for the rule to come out of Health and Human Services. Their piece of it is on the substance abuse side. Then DOT takes their piece and adds the transportation element of the rule. It is so far behind schedule, it is disgraceful. That SAMHSA and HHS cannot get this rule out more quickly, and DOT is ready to go. They want the rule. Incorporating that rule on front-end screening with the Drug Clearinghouse, which will be out soon, is enabler. Information, again, as we talked earlier, is very empowering. And having information for employers to look at and determine who's a user, who's used, It's a screening mechanism. However, that's just part of it. What Lane's describing is the ability to attract talent for them to pass in. We're also very concerned about the existing workforce and impairment. Unlike alcohol use and a breathalyzer where a state patrolman can test you roadside and immediately know if you're past the legal permission, that technology does not exist for marijuana. It just doesn't. It's probably 2-3 years out at best. So our ability to screen right then and there on impairment, we're really at a disadvantage as an industry. And so ATA just recently created a substance abuse and wellness committee with voting rights. Our first meeting, it's a very diverse mix of folks with backgrounds in drug testing, safety. State leaders will be in it, association leaders that have marijuana already legal. We want them in the room developing a policy platform, because I'm asked all the time in DC, where are you guys on this? And this is coming from legislators. I'm like, well, I'm going to answer that, and then I hope you will too, because we're interstate commerce. Feds are telling us it's illegal. 9 states in Canada say it isn't. You know, we're going to get caught in the middle. This is a litigious problem waiting to happen.
We did a story a couple of months ago about a set of truck drivers that had hauled, not knowing what was actually on the truck, what was actually, had driven across the state of Idaho, and were arrested for drug trafficking, unbeknownst to them, and they were in jail, and they were going to be prosecuted for. I'm wondering, how do you respond to that, where, to your point, the Canadian provinces and Canada have legalized marijuana, and there are states, there seems to be a broad trend to legalize marijuana, yet both movement of goods that have CBD in some states is an issue, as well as just cannabis overall. What is your thoughts on how ATA responds to this?
Well, and it's a cash-based system too, simply because the feds don't recognize it. So it's still illegal federally, but the feds aren't weighing in and enforcing it. So you have this gray area. Well, guess who falls in the middle of the gray area? We do. We're interstate commerce, we're crossing state lines. You know, state to state, different laws, different mixtures. We have the same problem in California to New Jersey on independent contractors. We have the same thing on the meal and rest break conflicts. The more our federal government sits back and is complacent, doesn't pass legislation, isn't clear on enforcement, you're going to see more and more states pass things like marijuana legalization that cause conflict, channel conflict within our federal state apparatus. And we're caught in the middle of it. So we're watching it closely, but what we need to be doing is creating good, sound policy platforms and advocacy. Because unless we tell these federal folks, this is a problem that's going to get worse if you don't engage, then that's what's going to happen.
Well, Chris, I know you have important work to do in Washington. It's an exciting time in the industry. We've never seen trucking this cool and this sexy that it is right now, but also a lot of things that people are dealing with. And I know that you have your work cut out for you. We thank you for coming here to Freight Alley.